For the past 40 years, I have been organizing agriculture workers, migrant agriculture workers in the United States, the majority of whom used to be peasants in Mexico. And, you know, those are the peasants that have been sent into bankruptcy by the actuation of the corporations, but also by the neoliberal policies imposed by the North to the South, in our case, the North American Free Trade Agreement, but in the last century also the Green Revolution of the early years of last century. So the farm workers in the United States, estimated in 2.5 to 4 million agricultural workers, are the majority, those peasants that at one point lost their capacity to feed their families in the communities and were forced to leave, you know, their homeland and seek employment in agricultural production in the United States. So for us, the rebuilding of the peasants' economies that have been destroyed is a very important issue. The issue of land inequality, more and more land, you know, going to the 1% of the agribusiness and corporations. So I'm here to express that, you know, that in these days it's very important that we all are part of, you know, keeping the peasant culture, the peasant way of producing food as the most important and critical element, especially in these horrible, terrible pandemic times.
It's really interesting what you're bringing up, because the voices of those who have been left outside of the conversation has already been an important part of the conversation today. What it sounds like you're saying is that you want to see us revisit and reimagine the conversation with farmers, with people who work the land, and people who've been displaced. Have I understood that correctly?
Yes, that's correct. And we're also part of La Via Campesina, which is an international movement. And my compañera Sochi, she will speak more about, you know, what is La Via Campesina. But seems to us that one critical aspect of, you know, the human crisis we are facing today is to recuperate that part of the struggle that we lost long time ago of protecting the land under the control of communities, small farmers, families, and, you know, as a way to oppose this terrible model of commercial and industrial food production imposed by a few corporations all over the world.
I would like to turn to some of the other panelists now and open this question. And Giotti, I'd definitely like to follow on Carlos's invitation to expand on the work that Via Campesina is doing. What challenges might farmers and farm workers be facing as they attempt to make a transition and imagine a different kind of food system? Giotti, I'll begin with you if I could.
Well, I'll just talk a little bit about Via Campesina and the visions that we've got. I mean, we represent farm workers, but more than that, we represent a model of agriculture that's been practiced by peasant farmers, indigenous people, pastoralists, fisher people around the world, models of food production that are based on working with the natural environment around you, where you use the resources that are available around you by paying attention to, you know, treating them with respect, and treating the resources that are there in a way that regenerates them and keeps them going for many generations of food production. And it's also a method of food production where it's not about producing a commodity so you can make a profit. It's about producing food that's very diverse, it's very nutritious for your community, for your family, and selling it within local and short supply chains. So it's not kind of shipping it all across the planet so that companies can make a lot of profit from it. And so it's very important to distinguish those different models of agriculture when we think about solutions. It's quite well known now that, you know, the food system is responsible to 30 to 40% of global emissions. And that's the food system as a whole, not just the methods of production, but the way that it's comprised. And the solution is the sort of agriculture that is represented by the members of La Via Campesina and peasant farmers around the world. And we call that agroecology. But a lot of the problems that generate all these emissions come from industrial agriculture, and it's a very different form of agriculture. And so when we look at solutions, it can't just be about, we've got to transform all of agriculture. It's about uplifting one model of agriculture and actually restricting the power that's causing so many problems that's there with the industrial food model. La Via Campesina represents 200 million small-scale farmers around the world, and it's different movements in different places that operate in such different contexts. But across the board, we're trying to work together to actually look at power and democracy and how our food system operates, so that we can get control of resources, so that we can take forward a model of agriculture that actually deals with the climate crisis. This agroecology can actually build soil that sequesters carbon. It brings trees into, your agricultural systems. It restores biodiversity, including agri-biodiversity, like all the different, plants and different sorts of livestock that are much more resilient. So, it's about trying to make sure that there's that the power that comes out there for transforming, for climate, when we give funds for the climate, and we're going to look at this very closely at the COP26, those funds for the climate should actually be going to grassroots organizations, to communities, so that they can build agroecology. That's the best way to actually deal with, stopping emissions that are coming from our food system.
I wanted to expand this conversation to look at, let's just say somebody is listening to this exact conversation that La Via Campesina is leading and says, yes, I'm thoroughly convinced by this model, but I'm entrenched in a different kind of farming. And I'd like to turn to Rashmeet and Pete Ritchie for this part of the conversation. In the transformation project, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that in the context of shifting farmers into new models of production. Rashmeet, could I begin with you?
Yeah, I'm happy to shed some light on that. So, as Giotti said, one side is like uplifting a better form of farming, and the other side is reducing industrial animal agriculture. And that's where the latter is where transformation comes in. What we do is we enable factory farmers, so individual growers who work as contract farmers for large meat or organizations. We enable them to transition from raising animals to growing plants. And what we do is essentially provide them with, connect them with anything and anyone that they need to be connected with in order to facilitate that transition. So that would mean from an initial stage of connecting them with experts in different forms of plants. The two plants that we specialize in right now are hemp and mushrooms. And then also connecting them with potential buyers of their crop at the end of the day. And anything in the middle as well, which would involve, say, grant applications and other things. So yeah, that's a bit about how we work. We're working with about 5 farmers right now across the US, and they all have different stories, different needs, and it's a very context specific thing,
Right.
transitioning. So yeah, that's just a bit about transformation. Yeah.
If I could just ask you, when you have those conversations, and I realize you're speaking to the incredible details of each person's context is not possible, but are there some challenges that people express, or concerns, worries that they express more regularly than others? What are some of the concerns that you hear as someone attempts to make this transformation?
Yeah. So the biggest reasons in the U.S., right, that the farmers want to transition, right? Like, we all come from potentially different reasonings for wanting the food system to change, but the farmers also have their own reasons for wanting to transition. And in the U.S., a big part of that is their financial hardship. So the way there are deep inequalities in agriculture in the U.S., right? So I mean, just in agriculture in general, they're like the top 4% of farms account for something like 69% of agricultural sales, whereas the bottom 76% of farms make up a mere like 3% of sales. So that's agriculture as a whole. But even within the like contract animal farming system, these inequalities are even starker because of how contract animal farming works. So basically what these farmers do is they sign contracts to raise animals on behalf of large corporations. And in order to do that, they need to take on huge amounts of loans to build these chicken houses, for example, right? They build a chicken house, and the average loan for a contract poultry grower is something around $700,000 in the US. And that's a huge amount of money that they need to pay back eventually. But when it comes to earning money, right, the way they earn money is through this like tournament system where they receive a base pay, but beyond that base pay, the remainder of their income comes from actually competing with all the farmers in their tournament, in their area, on who can produce basically the heaviest chicken for the least amount of feed. And this actually leads to a lot more inequality in the payments too. So these farmers are essentially, tired of, making like really low income at the end of the day, and are looking for a way out because they don't see themselves being able to grow in any way. But yeah, that's just from the farmer's side.
Thank you. That snapshot, I think, is quite a window into the experience of farmers and some of the challenges that they are facing. And what you've really described is the establishment of an economic system. So it's not just supply and demand when it comes to a particular product, but an actual establishment of a functioning between a community of farmers that is no longer beyond their control. And control seems to be a big theme that we heard about when we were speaking with Hindu Ibrahim. I want to turn to Pete Ritchie and just extend some of what Rashmeet is saying there, will extend to your work as well. You are with Nourish Scotland. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your work and how you've continued that conversation on transformation by including a conversation with civil society. Mr. Ritchie, your mute is still on.
Yeah. So, thank you. So in Nourish Scotland, we've been really keen to see the voice of farmers reflected in policy conversations about how we manage the transition to sustainable agriculture. As Rashmeet said, often farmers are just so busy trying to make a living, trying to survive, that they don't have the capacity to get involved. But even if they want to get involved, it can be really hard to find good ways to communicate. National governments feel an awful long way away. So what we've been doing with Nourish Scotland is also trying to support these much more local dialogues between farmers and their local authorities. And that's because a lot of citizens are very concerned about these issues too. They don't necessarily want to see farmers being abused, farmers being exploited, the land being exploited, the animals being exploited. Citizens have a concern about these things, but the food system is opaque to them. It's kept that way deliberately. It's kept so they can't understand what's going on. And if they see a cheap chicken in the shops, they think that's a bargain. They don't actually know. Most consumers have never seen a meat chicken. They've never seen a meat chicken in their lives. They think it's a little brown thing that wanders around and clucks, but it looks nothing like that. It looks like a dinosaur. They've never seen a chicken that they eat most that they think is a cheap form of meat. So trying to get dialogues going between farmers and citizens in the local community, in the city near where the farmers are, in the local authority where the farmers are, is really, really important. And we've been doing one example of this in Scotland with something called a Farming 1.5 report, where we actually got family farmers together on a panel with scientists and with environmentalists. And we came up over a year and a half with a consensus report on the way forward, which is about limiting overall livestock production in Scotland, instead of getting off the growth model and trying to get onto a steady state model, and then looking at, well, how can farmers continue to make a living? And as Jyoti says, a lot of this is about delivering other public goods through agroecology, reducing some of their costs by working with nature, working with the animals rather than exploiting them. But it is really difficult because in Scotland, like everywhere else, farmers are locked into an industrial model, which means that packing more animals into a shed is seen as the best way forward. It's seen as the way to make a living for them. And we're seeing farmers in Scotland, like the rest of the UK and the rest of Europe, diversifying from extensive productions of beef and sheep into intensive chicken production. And as Rashmeet says, begin with it all seems fine. They take the loan, they get the shed, they're going to get the birds, they're going to get the feed, they're going to make some money, and then the ratchet starts. But they're into the bank for £500,000, so they have to keep producing the chicken. And so we do need ways to develop policies that allow farmers to transition to sustainable forms of agriculture. And there'll be different opportunities for different farmers. When Rashmi was talking, I thought, well, we can't grow vegetables very well on our farm. We're too hilly, we're too wet, the soil's too heavy, it's not a good soil for vegetables. But we are starting to grow hemp around here. That's an alternative crop that's very good for the planet, and has got, you know, markets that can be developed. So I think there are opportunities for diversification, but underlying all that, we can't have just a top-down approach that says, here's the global policy to tackle climate change. We're going to have nature-based solutions. We need to have bottom-up policies that are developed by farmers with communities that work for their place too, and where we expose each other to this conversation about what sort of food system do you want in the future and how can we create that? Because if we leave it to the market, you know, the danger is that 50 by 40 will have the wrong 50% of livestock rather than the right 50%.
I want to expand on that, because what you're talking about is a holistic picture, and we've managed to touch on a number of different issues here, from climate conversations and how the policy needs to support what's happening on the ground, and what you're speaking about, which is an inclusive conversation where farmers participate. I'd like to talk to Mustafa Kamel Gai now, who is looking at green jobs specifically. Mustafa, in a recent assessment by the International Labour Organization, a transition to plant-based diets was said to have the potential to create 19 million jobs in Latin America and the Caribbean. Could you comment on some of those findings?
Thank you very much. I mean, from the Iowa side, we are labor organization, and it's important to bring the conversation that the Iowa was set up in 1919 with a primary mandate to advance social justice. The reason why the Iowa was created is essentially to advance social justice and to promote decent work for all. So for that matter, an important slogan that we use in the world of work is that labor is not a commodity. We don't treat labor as a commodity. Now, in this context, part of our work is to understand that jobs depend on sustainable environment and ecosystems that are stable and the services they provide. And so that's why we estimate that 1.2 billion jobs at least depend on healthy ecosystems. So it's therefore important to take care of nature, the natural capital, if you like, that will sustain job creation. And so the analysis that you're referring to is a report that has been produced jointly by the Inter-American Development Bank and the ILO, where we took at the regional level a global analysis we've done 2 years ago to look at what could be the impact on jobs of pursuing a low carbon economy. So as you say rightly, in our analysis, we see that if Latin America and the Caribbean countries were to move to a net zero emission economy, and in particular in the food system, promoting more sustainable modalities of farming and diets, it has the potential to generate up to 19 million full-time equivalent jobs. Now, we do see in that transition some loss of jobs. We spoke about the job creation, but there will be about 4 million jobs lost, but these will be in livestock, and that's really about the cost of moving from what we clearly know to be an unsustainable pattern of livestock, dairy, fishing, to something that is more sustainable. It's short-term losses, but long-term gains.
A small technical issue. Can you still hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for that. The conversation on what kinds of jobs will be created and what jobs will be lost and how many jobs will be produced in a transition is obviously of great interest. I see some connections forming as you talk about the financial independence, and Rashmeet and Pete Ritchie were also speaking about some of the picture that we see of financial dependence. Speaking to that, Mustafa, could you please talk about some of the ways that young farmers are finding financing, and if there are models that you've seen that allow an avoidance of those buy-in schemes that marry a farmer to a particular corporate structure or private entity?
Well, personally, I think that there are different ways, innovative ways to engage young people into farming. You know, I speak from my own region in Western Africa, where you see a major migration movement, unwanted labor migration, people looking for better future for themselves. And agriculture can actually deliver good jobs for many of these young people. But this has been sort of as a work for the elderly. What we see is very encouraging new ways for young people to enter into farming, not working for others, but working for themselves or going through cooperative small scale companies that, in addition to going into sustainable form of agriculture, organic farming, also connecting information and communication technologies with the way to run a farm, running irrigation systems, controlling their farms with that kind of technology. And I think this is very promising, and it's getting a lot of young people back to agriculture. I'm not young, but I can say I'm part of that movement going back to agriculture.
Thank you very much for those comments. Carlos and Giotti, I want to come to you for a moment. And I'd also like to encourage our participants to use the Slido tool. I'm going to be coming to your questions next. Carlos and Giotti, what would you see as some of the socioeconomic benefits of a shift away from livestock production? You've spoken at length about why or how you engage in that work, but what do you see as the actual benefits of that shift? Carlos, we could begin with you if you like.
Okay, thank you. Let me tell you a story. Some time ago, I met this group of people who are fighting the meatpacking industry. The meatpacking industry in the United States is one of the main contributors to greenhouse emissions. And you have read recently, how the meatpacking industry is the hot spot for the COVID-19 contagion going on in the United States. So I was talking with these friends, and I asked them, what was the reason behind them, opposing the meatpacking industry? And they told me that they were really concerned with the instances of animal cruelty going on in the meatpacking industry, the beef factories. And so they say that, that they promote, a kind of a vegetarian principle, in opposition to the consumption of beef. And I asked them, what about the cruelty against the farm workers who pick those vegetables in the fields? Because if you take the example of California, most of the vegetable production that feeds the vegetarian market is coming from Mexico, specifically from the Pacific part of Mexico, where you can still find children working in the fields producing all these nice vegetables to feed the California market. So, but of course, we all envision a food system that is not only dedicated to satisfy the human needs, the nutritional needs of people, or families, or communities, but that also respect the integrity of nature. And actually, in La Via Campesina, we have many movements going on. We are a worldwide movement of people fighting every day and working every day for something that we call food sovereignty, which is an alternative to this terrible model of commercial and industrial food production. But like as you asked earlier, and my compañera Xochitl mentioned, we face many challenges in order to advance towards that that vision of a different and alternative food system, a different model of production and consumption, one has to be, of course, the consumers. And I'm very pleased that Peter and Rashmit, spoke about, the relationship that we need to build between producers and civil society, communities, because we have a model of this terrible model, and it's maintained by consumers. They are the ones that sustain this terrible model. So
that holistic picture is going to be such an important one as this conversation goes forward. You've been speaking about the important roles of building partnerships, the importance of scientific relationships, the importance of relationships with indigenous communities, but you are now mentioning the person who actually consumes the end product and buys it, and what kinds of power they have to influence this system. Carlos, I am so sorry to cut you off. I want to give you just a moment to wrap up your thought, but then I would like to go to Giotti and also get her impressions.
Very rapidly, two other points. First, the institutions and the governments. We now see that, for example, from FAO to the United States Department of Agriculture, they are, they include both the promoters of industrial agriculture and the small farmers. And that is not working. You cannot please God and the devil at the same time. So we need to push those institutions to our side, to the model of agricultural production we have. But also we need to start thinking about how we can make structural changes. For example, in the South, peasants, the first point in the agenda of the peasant movement is agrarian reform. But in the North, we have a big problem. And the big problem is that agricultural production is based on private ownership of land. How can we speak about, creating a model of food production and consumption that is controlled by the communities, that is controlled by organizations, when we have an individualistic way of promoting the land ownership to produce food? So in that regard, I think that is very important that that especially the farmers of the North begin departing and begin trying to differentiate from what they propose in regards to food production, different from the corporations and from farm capital. We need to start convincing farmers to depart from those concepts of productivity, of access to markets, trying to compete with capital, and more, like Sochi said at the beginning, to transform food production to satisfy the human needs of people, families, communities, and then to take care of the integrity of nature.
Thank you so much for your comments. Jyoti, I want to come to you. Part of the conversation started with the socioeconomic benefits, but clearly we've expanded into a holistic picture of responsibility. I'd like to turn to you with two questions. One being what you see as the socioeconomic benefits for everybody in our communities in this shift away from livestock production. But I'd also like to deliver one of the questions from our participants today. One of the participants has asked whether farmers on the panel have advice for how environmentalists can better make connections with farmers, especially industrial livestock farmers, to build trust. So I realize I've thrown a lot at you in one go, but I want to make best use of the time. Jyoti, I'd be interested in your comments.
Mm-hmm. I am a livestock farmer, so I don't advocate a total shift away from livestock production. I think, as Carlos highlighted, there's different models of food, animal production and livestock production, and absolutely a complete shift away from industrial models of livestock production. Just shut them all down. We've got to get rid of factory farmed meat. That is one of the huge things going on. But I think livestock has taken a big hit when we're talking about the climate crisis, and actually we need to get rid of fossil fuels. That's the number one action that needs to happen, and livestock can play a very important role in small, in small scale farming and agroecology, but it's in a it's a very limited role, and it's a very much a part of mixed farming systems. So, for instance, if you have pigs and they eat the waste food products on a farm, or have chickens that have like the scraps on a small holding, that would be very sustainable, but it's very different from the big sheds full of chickens being raised by the thousands, fed on soya and commodity crops that can be grown on land where there should be forest. It's a very different picture, and I think we need to skill up farmers to be able to raise this sort of livestock, which I call default livestock, or the FAO calls it default livestock, which is livestock that's a byproduct of a system that's primarily focused on arable for human consumption, and it's only using the waste products of those systems for a very small amount of livestock production that can have an important social benefits and also economic benefits as well. But shifting farmers to those models they need so much support to be able to do that. I mean, I was just visiting this morning a large farm in Devon in the south of England, where there's huge fields full of sheep. Those farms are going to need to transition, so they start putting trees onto those farms. They can de-intensify, have fewer animals, but find other income streams to help support their livelihoods going alongside that. I was trying to advise that farm, bring on a market garden, get some young people onto the land here that are going to be growing loads of fruit and veg, put some apple trees all across the land and get your sheep underneath the apple trees, and you can make cider and you can make juice and you can make jams and put black currants all around the edges. You can make your farms so rich. We don't have to have these farms focused all on single production of one animal, and that'll enrich all our lives and bring in so many more diverse income streams. That farm, which was one farmer, doing 900 acres of sheep, could actually have 10 families supported on there doing diverse, agroecological farming. And that would be a great economic benefit to the whole community, as well as having the local food at the local farmers market so much richer and more interesting for all the people eating that food.
That is an absolutely wonderful picture that you've managed to paint for us. I want to come to the question of the protection of rights, which is something that many of you have worked on. With the protection of rights in mind, as we speak about equity and a just transition, how do we really ensure food security for all people while maintaining those values of a just transition? Pete, Richie, perhaps I could first come to you, and then Rashmid, I'd like to hear some comments from you.
Wow, that's a big question.
I know it's an enormous question. We really have been basing a lot of this conversation on how to make a transition, but if we really look at the word just in that, how do we make that happen? How do we make that a reality?
Okay, well, I just want to go back a couple of steps, and I think we've not talked so much about the pandemic and the impact that's had on not just on the food system locally, but I think on how people think about the food system. So and you'll all have been talking to colleagues from around the world during this time, and what's become really evident is that cities have woken up and realized that they're dependent on these long supply chains, on unaccountable commodity suppliers, and that the fields around them are not growing food for the city and they're not growing food for the local area. And there's no way of getting the food quite often from the fields outside the city into the city. We've become so disconnected in the way that we do food. And I think that has changed the global debate. And I think for the first time for a long time, I think it's possible to think again about local first, global second, very much the food sovereignty mantra that, food systems should be conceived and designed and supported locally to feed local populations. And then if you can do that, you export food, you import food that you can't grow. That refocusing the global system on that is important. And coming around to the issue of rights, there was a fascinating paper by the Special Rapporteur, Michael Fakhri, over the summer, which went to the UN, where he talked about the agreement on agriculture and the trade agreements we have, which have been predicated on the idea that the best thing we can possibly do in the world is to ship huge tonnages of food from one country to another and ship feed from one place, feed animals somewhere else, then shift the food back, then move it somewhere else for packaging and processing. And that idea about shifting food around the world is economic orthodoxy. And the idea has been that the more of that we do, the better for everybody. Mm-hmm. But I think if we take a right to food perspective and we start thinking about how can we organize our institutions so that everybody is nourished in the world, that becomes a primary goal of the food system in a way that conserves and restores nature. if you take that rights-based approach, fundamentally building your food system around the right to food, it means you have to change trade. It means you have to change, as Carlos says, the relationship people have with land. So land is seen as something that has to be used for the public good to provide sustainable food. Then I think you can integrate this idea about a just transition. But what we know is that we can't simply use one or two policy levers to deliver just transition, whether that's paying for nature-based solutions at some global level, or having, planting a lot of trees. We have to consider all these different actions on the basis of the right to food to say, how will this deliver nourishment to people in a way that supports, the beauty and diversity of the planet? Start from there and not try to create sort of top-down solutions that, in a sense, preserve the same relationships of power and maintain food simply as a commodity to be traded globally. As Mustafa said, labor isn't a commodity, and food shouldn't be seen as a commodity either.
Rashmeet, I wonder if you would like to make a few comments following what Pete has just shared with us.
I think Pete summed that up really well. And what comes to mind, especially with the last piece of what Pete just said, is like, if you look at the example of Oatley, the oat milk company that recently suffered a lot of backlash from their consumers for taking in a huge investment from Blackstone, which is an investment group that's like supported fossil fuels and other things in the past. It's interesting because I feel like these companies and other key players start out with the right intentions in mind, but then we get entrenched into the same capitalistic system, which requires these companies to operate in a certain way. So I think as the food system transitions, the people leading these transitions need to ensure that they maintain control of their vision and the ultimate goal, and not hand over control and power to the same people that have led to the exploitation of everything in the path, right? Like, I mean, we focus on the exploitation of the environment or like animals, but like, as we're talking about here, the agricultural system even exploits farmers who are, the very people that grow the food for these companies. So yeah, I think a just transition will be very tiered, with like different goals such as, sustainability or food sovereignty and whatnot. But as we go through each of those goals, I think we need to be very mindful of maintaining control and ensuring that the vision of, a sustainable, compassionate, and just food system is carried out. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I would like to return to Mustafa for a moment. How would you frame a just transition in farming from the perspectives of job creation?
Well, I think for us, we have a set of guidelines that come from a tripartite process, which involve governments, workers, and employees, organizations. And so we think that's a useful framework, because we need to understand that the transition to sustainable food systems based on sustainable agriculture is going to deliver socio-economic gains, but at the same time, it will entail socio-economic transformations. Some of it are deep transformations that will be painful for some. So therefore, it's important to find a way to go through that transition in a way that maximizes the opportunities, but not leaving anyone behind. If we need to change production, it must be done in a way that is based on social dialogue. And that's why it's important to engage with everyone. And so we don't see that effectively done with farmers, local communities be part of that engagement in shaping policies. There's a lot of vested interests. Some have more weight in decision making than others. So we feel that social consensus is indispensable for the transition.
I'd like to just ask you, because you sit at such an interesting position in comparison to many people who are part of this conversation. You are really deep into the conversation on job creation, and you work at the policy level for some of the some of the projects that you work on. Are you seeing a willingness towards a shift, or are we still in the early stages of that conversation when you talk about those vested interests or those larger players at the table?
What I can say is generally when we discuss just transition, especially in the context of climate change, the focus has been on energy. There's been a lot of effort on how to transform energy systems. And it seems to me that there is a growing shift that economic and social transformations for sustainability is also important in other sectors, in particular agriculture, in transport, also and construction and other sectors, but in particular agriculture. And I can say that last year we had a bilateral between the Director General of the ILO and the new Executive Director of UN Environment. They both agreed that agriculture is the next frontier for sustainability. We need to know better what needs to be done, how to find innovative solutions, socially acceptable, and go at the pace that will be possible. So just to flag that there is a recognition that not enough has been done and that we need to move faster than what is taking place right now. But just to say that this must be done within a policy process, of which engagement of the actors in the real economy will be fundamental. And the farmers, communities have to be at the center of that engagement.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. I can't believe that we're almost out of time. There's so many different ideas at the table that need some examination. I'm going to turn to I've been drawing some of our questions from our audience. This one is about the impact of urbanization on farmers. And the question is it possible, or is there a model for people who live in cities to join the farmer force? And this is a question about urbanization and the impact on farmers. I would like to open that up to any of the panelists who feel that they might have a comment on that. Maybe you could just raise your hand if any of you. I'll start with Pete, and I didn't see if Mustafa raised his hand or not. I don't think so. Okay, Pete, could you please begin with that conversation on urbanization and farmers? And it's interesting that you should be the one to answer, because you did say that you're seeing an incredible opportunity in COVID-19 as we understand from an urban perspective a connection with the land. Oops, I think you might still be muted.
It's a great question. And I want to pick up on Mustafa's point about young people wanting to return to farming. And, Giotti as well would have seen this in the UK. Thousands of young people want to get involved in food production. But often they live in the city, and it's really hard in the UK to get hold of any land because the way that it's concentrated in so few hands. In Scotland, 400 people own half of the land in Scotland. So it's very hard to get land. So young people are increasingly getting into urban horticulture, urban growing. And we see a huge future for that, particularly if we can get rid of some of the cars in our cities and take over some of the space that the cars take up and recreate cities that are vibrant food producing environments. It's low carbon, it's fresh, it creates a lot of employment per acre compared to, as Giotti says, the 900-acre farm with one person working on it. There's huge possibilities, I think, to produce not just a significant amount of the city's food, but also to create it in ways that are socially just and to make it available to people, in their own communities fresh, and to reconnect people with food in a really important way that we certainly lost in parts of Scotland. And I think that also brings cities more into dialogue with farmers, because they start to understand, well, here's the food we can produce and here's the food we can't produce, and we need to rely on others to produce it. But that bringing cities into the food producing arena is hugely important. And obviously, different parts of the world, there's been a big investment in that. And we're really glad to be seeing more of that now in the UK.
Thank you very much for that, Pete. I have time for one last question, and I'd like to direct this one to Giotti Fernandez. How do we center farmers and farm workers in the movement to transform food systems, in your opinion?
Well, I think you need to build up the civil society organizations that are working on this, raise their voices and the projects put forward by them. For instance, in La Via Campesina, we're working with creating these agroecology training networks, which are farmer-to-farmer training networks all over the world, involving millions of farmers. And, it's very different from an individual project or an advisor just going one by one out to farmers. When you work through the programs that are actually put together by these enormous social movements across the world, where people can speak to each other, you know, in the way that they understand to each other. So, you know, it's about training farmers, and then those farmers training each other, and they go back to their villages and carry on that training. So it's got this massification effect. You know, we can share these skills all across the planet with each other through these networks. And that's very different from a government-led program or something run by the FAO, you know, and you know, through the funding that we've got to transform the planet towards better, you know, to solve the climate crisis, basically, and better management of natural resources, and to deal with biodiversity and bring back and restore everything that we need to act rapidly, and we have to multiply the impact of every little action and bit of funding we put towards this. And I think working with social movements to uplift the programs that they are creating is the best way to do that.
Thank you so much, Giotti. Carlos, I'd like to come to you on the same question. How would you like to see farmers and farm workers placed at the center of a conversation on transforming food systems?
Well, to begin with, we have a common goal, and it's to protect agriculture, culture, agriculture history, but also to protect the rural communities, because today what we have is kind of an abuse by the city, the urban centers, against rural communities. One example is that many cities in the United States are buying farmland, not to grow food, but only to access the water rights of the farmland in order to satisfy the needs of the people of the big cities. One very important I think work that we can do together as farmers and farm workers is to convince society, to convince consumers that they have to, you know, that they have to embrace another model of food production and food consumption, because as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, consumers are the ones supporting this terrible model that we face today, that we want to confront in order to build something better. For many years, we have been advocating, we have been giving presentations to different groups of what you can call civil society, including in our community in the border region. And we have been proposing a concept that allow us to explain what model of food production and consumption we would like to see. This concept is that we invite people to only consume oppression-free food. Oppression-free food means that I don't consume food that is causing suffering to human beings or devastation to nature. And the idea is that the consumers start thinking more about the type of food they consume, the type of food they buy, the places where they buy. We need to, you know, to convince people to liberate from the tyranny of the supermarket and of the big corporations. They need to start thinking more on how they can promote a model of consumption that will help flourish the small farmers markets in our places, in our cities. So I think that we as farm workers and as small farmers, family farmers, we have a lot in common, and that commonality is to convince, you know, the large sector of society that they have to embrace a different model of food production, what we call it La Via Campesina, food sovereignty.
Right. Carlos, thank you so much. I'd like to thank all of our panelists today. If you're curious about their work, you can find everything on the Global Engagement Summit website about all of their many accomplishments in their work. I think some of the best words I've heard today are oppression-free food, which I think is something that we'd all like stamped on the side of the products that we purchase. Thank you everyone for all of your comments. I want to give you we have a small gift, an artistic gift. We have a sketch artist standing by. Meg Brennan has been participating and capturing the panel as we go along, and this is his depiction of the conversation that we are having today. I love the little lines that go out the sides, all your amazing ideas just electrifyingly popping off of all of you. Thank you again. Has been a real honor to hear your words, and as always, with less time and less space than we would have liked, but thank you for joining us in this digital space today. To everybody who is joining us from around the world, we have participants from more than, oh, thank you very much. We have participants from more than 60 countries with us, which is part of the reason this has been such a vibrant exchange. Thank you so much for all of your polling questions. They are so thoughtful and interesting, and I'm just sorry that I haven't been able to get to all of them.